Welcome back to Runway Life, the podcast for everybody in aviation. Kate, Craig, and we're on the phone with Stacey Heaton, which is the Southern Manager for AOPA. Stacey, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You and I connected this week over a Facebook post that I actually read and was kind of concerned about the regular occurrence of airports trying to enact landing fees. The one that, of course, I saw, which was my home airport for quite a long time, was Kissimmee. What can you go? I'm just going to let you really talk about it at this point, and we'll get into the nitty gritty of Q&A. But tell me what's going on. It seems like it's happening across the U.S. as well, not just in Florida.
That is a true statement that it seems to be happening all across the United States. For the particular case here in Florida, however, it's got some nuances to it that certainly brought some questions in our mind, gave us enough concern to be able to certainly bring attention to it, especially with our members that were not understanding why this was happening, whether it could in fact be done, whether it was legal or not, why they're doing it, and the true why is the question that many ask. So we came to learn that the Florida Department of Transportation had issued a request for proposals in 2023, so just last year, for aircraft counting and operations data tracking. Excuse me, I'm sorry for my throat.
Okay.
And so they issued this request for proposals, and they actually did it twice. The first one they did not award, and it's not clear as to why they didn't award from the first RFP. But they issued a second one later in the year last year, and from that they selected a company called Vertower. And there's a couple of different companies that provide very similar technologies to help airports track the aircraft that utilize their airports. So the aircraft tracking information is absolutely helpful to airports and the Florida DOT. The reason why it's helpful is because aircraft operations are used in part to help administration of grants. It helps administrators figure out how to right size a facility, if you will. And it also helps them to prioritize where their grant monies should go. So prior to aircraft counting technologies, you had different ways of counting aircraft. There were rules of thumb, and this is specific to where there's less than a 24-hour traffic air traffic control tower, right? And that's at most airports, especially general aviation airports, right? Less than 24 hours. So you've got several hours where it's just unknown how many operations really come in. And if they don't have a tower at all, then you can either have somebody with a clicker and a clipboard to count, or you use industry rules of thumb that have been around for decades in airport planning. X number of operations per based aircraft, that kind of thing. Well, the problem is that it's just inaccurate to do rules of thumb because once you've seen one airport, you have basically seen one airport. Every airport is so different in terms of what their based customers are made up of, in terms of their itinerant or visiting traffic, what that's made up of. So every airport is different. So this information is very beneficial to a state aviation organizations such as the Florida DOT, Department of Aviation. And so Vertower is one that has actually, I think, contracted with a couple other states. If you check their website, you could see what other states they have partnered with. Um, The issue came to light, though, that as soon as the contract was known for Vertower, uh, Vertower invited several airports to come on, join on a webinar and learn about their technology because it's coming. It's going to be available, not forced upon the Florida public use airports, but available to them.
Mhm.
And so Vertower wanted to get the word out. So there was this webinar that was held. And on this webinar, though, it was primarily introducing the airport managers that were on the call to their partner, their business partner, called Vector. Now, Vector is known around the country for several years because they are used at usually most larger 139 or air carrier airports. And what they do is they issue landing fee invoices to pilots. And it's again, it's based on what the airport has set in their rates and fees. Um, it can vary. They could do it based on weight of the aircraft. They can do it based on a per landing. Um, the objective though is to try to hit the traffic that they are trying to capture, and so their policies might vary from airport to airport. So, it was a little disconcerting to learn that and you could see this on Vectors, and I think it's also on Vertower's website, the announcement of their business partnership. So it was disconcerting that the webinar was mostly marketing the landing fee services to these airport managers. Now, people might say, well, Stacey, that's no big deal. Airports can institute landing fees. Well, you're absolutely right. They can. There's a lot of caveats with that. There's a lot of specifics. And again, once you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. The bigger issue for AOPA is that in my discussions with Vector, they shared that, well, in fact, I believe that he used the term, it's a loose partnership, but it's a partnership nonetheless in our minds because that's how they advertised it. So he says it's a loose partnership and that they actually will utilize the same data that's collected, um, that's going to be collected for Florida DOT. They will pay Vertower to use that data, and they use that data in part and cross-reference with a whole other set of data. For those who may not understand, there's an ADSB technology. There is called that's swim data. Uh, and I'm at the moment I can't recall what the swim stands for, but it's information that's available based on the um, ADSD information in an aircraft. So what happens is Vector explained that, well, yes, they purchase the same information and data from Vertower, the same data that Vertower is giving the Florida DOT, but they also use another third party ADSB source. They cross-reference these so that they can scrub the data, and then they send landing fees based on that particular airport's policy. Well, for us at AOPA, we were deeply involved in the requirement for equipping with ADSB equipment several years ago. And at no point was it intended that the data that the FAA was collecting or anybody being able to grab surveillance data like a Vertower, anybody that has that ability, at no point did we ever want it to be used or was it intended to be used against pilots, either for enforcement actions or in this case to issue landing fees. So that this is a big onion here in Florida. That's one layer of it, right? That's probably the biggest national issue that we've got going right now is this was not its intended use. and that aircraft owners were forced, in essence, to equip their aircraft, and it was not cheap to do so. The other piece of the national picture, and it also applies a little bit in Florida, is the fact that our members and not even if they're not our members, but aircraft owners in general, when they fly and they purchase fuel, um, those some of the taxes from those fuels help pay for these airports. And so, in the case of Florida, the majority of Florida DOT Aviation's projects and funding comes from the state aviation fuel tax. So here our members are paying this portion into both state and federal to help airports.
Mhm.
And then it in turn is having a contract with a technology provider who is in turn using it against our own aircraft owners.
Yep.
So they're getting hit upon hit, everything from hanger rates going up exponentially and insurance rates and landing fees of special event fees. I mean, you've seen that
Yep. Well,
that go on.
When you and I spoke initially, it was SoCal Flying Monkey, cool YouTuber, and he had gotten word of all the landing fees at Las Vegas airport for like F1, for the Super Bowl, for major special events, and basically he took it upon himself and really decided he was gonna fight this fight. And that initially opened my eyes to the fact that there's a lot of different actions at place where people have decided, whether it's an airport, whoever it might be, we are going to make some money off of these pilots and or aircraft owners, period. And I just see that as being massively unfair. And so, of course, when I saw this first, the email from you that was shared with me through a Facebook group, I said, no, I want to draw attention to this because I feel like there's way too many people that do not know that this is happening. And we've got to open it up to the whole country so that people can see it.
Right. No, absolutely. And I mean, if you can just picture all the upcoming events on the West Coast, they're going to be coming here soon. The if I could say there was a good part that happened after we brought attention to the issue in Las Vegas, was that the FAA came in and they made the airport prove how much money they actually needed to put out. I mean, yes, they needed to have extra services provided and personnel, and that all makes sense when you're getting inundated because of a special event. But it's that when there is no rationale, when there is nothing proven, and I believe that's the biggest problem that we see is airports don't know exactly how much it might take for them to run their airfield, how much money it really takes for them to run their airport as a whole, and then cost centers, because you need to be fair. That's another point that we'll start talking about in a little bit. But these rates and these fees are allowed if they are fair and reasonable. It's that big fair and reasonable part that um, FAA, we believe, needs to really step up and force the airports before they institute any of these fees to go through and prove why they need to charge the fees that they're asking for.
Yeah.
Because they are there to provide a service to the public. They are public use, publicly obligated because they've accepted federal grants, and they are providing a service to ensure that transportation, it is a mode of transportation. I might choose to ride a bicycle to work, my neighbor might choose to ride a scooter to work, but it is still public transportation. I'm using the sidewalks, I'm using the roadways. It's public transportation. And just because pilots chose to use aircraft as their mode of transportation does not mean that they should get shorthanded and just looked at like, oh, they're pilots, they can obviously afford this. No, sir. That is the exact wrong way to view this. It needs to be fair and
Yeah.
reasonable.
And well,
So
just to close out the landing fees, those massive landing fees, if I remember that correctly, the airports that were in question have never had to run in deficit. In fact, they had over $1 million in their holding funds that before they ever even enacted any of these ridiculous landing fees for special events. So that brings it back to where you say, you know, the FAA asked them to prove that they needed to. And, you know, okay, fine. They needed to for a certain extent of some of those monies, but, you know, fair and reasonable went completely out the window with a $4,000 landing fee. So
the FAA is certainly challenged in terms of they have a lot of airports that they need to keep watch over. And honestly, they don't really watch over them until there is an issue. There's just not enough FAA personnel to do that. So only when an AOPA or an EAA or another association or a pilot, a user themselves brings up a complaint through the complaint process. There's the informal process, part 13, and then there's the very formal, very expensive process, part 16. Unless it's brought to their attention, they won't know. So it's really important that our members and any users of these public use airports keep an eye out for what's going on. Are they behaving in a fair and reasonable manner? Are they being honest with what they're doing? You referenced their revenues. So again, getting back to one of the challenges is for an airport now is that the FAA doesn't provide a really hard line in terms of how much reserves they need to have. They say for reasonable, reasonable amount of reserves and reasonable this and reasonable that. So there's no hard line in the sand. So I understand the predicament that some of these airport managers are in, but it certainly begs the question of, well, if it causes so much angst and problem, then how come there isn't a formula or a checklist or did you do X, Y, and Z? Help the airports remain in compliance by giving them additional guidance so that they, treat everybody fair and reasonably. So that's just yet another layer of the onion, if you will.
So do you think that airports are transitioning from like charging 135 operations or like jets or businesses and stuff to now charging more like general aviation with this act?
So it's funny you asked that. When these fees started to come up recently, and especially in light of the ones here in Florida, we did a quick survey, informal survey inside AOPA of hey, where do you guys see these? And it is the rarity that a general aviation airport has these landing fees. It's just a rarity. Again, there's landing fees in the realm of the 135, or excuse me, the 121 air carrier airports. But it's a rarity at the general aviation level, and now it's coming down to that. They are seeking revenue sources from wherever, and I understand their predicament as well. And you'll hear them push back that, well, their AIP, which is the Airport Improvement Program, the grant monies that these general aviation airports receive, their entitlements have not changed. It's $150,000 a year. Construction costs and everything have risen, yet that amount that they get annually has not risen in a very, very long time. I want to say 20 years. I could be misquoted, but it's something along that lines. It's been a very long time since that has been increased.
Yeah.
Now they can roll up to 4 years of that to use towards a bigger project, but when you're talking about, even just a 4,000, 5,000 foot runway, the construction costs have just skyrocketed, and they are strapped for cash because the
Yeah.
feds have not opened up the AIP entitlements to anything greater to help them meet the need of the national transportation system.
Yeah.
So I understand the predicament that they are in, yet we continue to put back to it has to be fair and reasonable. So,
Yeah.
for example, and forgive me if you have another question, certainly cut me off and ask me. Um, the question that I ask most these days is, okay, general aviation airport who might have 2 runways, they might have a 6,000 foot runway, and they might have a 4,000 foot runway. When you are getting down to issuing landing fees to, say, a flight school that's from a different airport, they're coming, they're practicing touch and goes. Here's my question. How much does a touch and go really use of that runway? The FAA's own runway design program, you could play around in that and pretty quickly realize that you can increase the number of operations in the program for aircraft below, say, 6,000 pounds, and nothing changes in the design criteria. It's only when you change the larger aircraft that the design criteria will start to change, and you'll
Yeah.
see more stringent construction requirements. So the real question is, if somebody's flying in and practicing touch and goes, for example, is it really fair and reasonable that you're going to charge them when on a touch and go, in reality, the full weight of the aircraft is not even hitting the pavement in a true
Yeah.
touch and go, right? Because you're still moving fast enough that some of the weight is still being carried on your wings.
Yeah.
And I know that might seem like we're getting down into the details, but you know what? When it comes to fair and reasonableness, it does in fact take time to get down to realize what in fact is fair, what in fact is reasonable, who is really paying for these when these folks that are doing their training and touching down on a touch and go, they do pay their fair share into the tax system, into the overall system through their
Yeah.
aviation fuel taxes.
Yeah, and really, like, it affects, it affects the students, it affects people like myself. Um, since I'm the operations manager here at First Landings, like, I have grown to care, and I get to hear these students, as they work, 2, 3 jobs or save up their money so that they can pursue this passion. And it's also something they love doing. So, like, when they fly to other airports or when we go on flyouts and things like that, and for the cost to start increasing and having all these fees when they're just trying to, whether it's pursuing a career or doing it for fun, like, it affects them. It changes the price for them, which is understandable for, I feel like, when you're talking about like air carriers, like, okay, they're a business, they're making money from this, you're charging them a fee. But like general aviation, a lot of it's people like, just having their life savings or everything that they work for just to pursue flying.
Yeah, summing that up, I mean, the average flight student, when they're paying anywhere from $9,000 to $14,000, depending on what school they go to, that could impact them by $2,000 just during the private. And I think that's a really, really rough number, hard number, rough, to be able to justify. I mean, obviously, after we spoke, I went ahead and looked at the DeLand. Now, DeLand Airport, the people got involved, which is really what we're hoping people will do, and part of the reason for this podcast. But the people got involved. They got out there. They spoke at the county or the city commissioners meeting. But one of the things, and I listened to both of them that actually concern this. So, I put my headphones on and listen to, 4 hours worth of yammering to a certain extent from the commissioners. The airport manager said some things in the first one that really got my heckles up. The mayor, I believe, might have said a few things that definitely got my heckles up. We need to implement these landing fees because other airports are going to do it, and we need to stop that traffic from coming here. Now, at that point, I have a little bit of a concern that sounds a lot like discrimination. We need to try to enforce this to stop others from coming here. And that sounds a lot like they're not allowed to do that under the FAA guidelines with the federal grants that airports get. It's a big concern.
I'll share a little bit. Absolutely. In terms of an airport wanting to deter traffic, an airport wanting to control noise, an airport wanting to make the call and make policy because they believe they have air safety at the center of it. While that is very noble of them regarding safety, both controlling of traffic, or I should say all three of controlling of traffic, trying to control noise, and the issue of aircraft safety in flight are all federally preempted. Airports are not allowed to institute policies or fees or what have you to try to control traffic, try to deter traffic. And that it was very disconcerting when we heard that. I watched the same videos as you did. It was just we needed to educate them, and sometimes it doesn't require groups coming out with pitchforks, if you will, which sometimes these public meetings can appear that way. But when there's just blatant violations like that, yet they're not seeing it, and FAA is not at the table to tell them they can't do it, then it's upon us, the users, to make sure we show up there and we express this. So, but let's get to the safety factor, right? And everything, Caitlyn, that you were mentioning, right? You're a student, and I happen to know a gentleman in the Daytona area who teaches, and he has literally had students say, I can't afford this anymore. I can't afford it. And they're going to layer this on. And by the way, 4 airports that were going to do it all at the same time at the same rate, which is a whole other layer to that onion, mind you, that we probably don't have time to get into. But so this is when a city council or a city commissioner says, will this really impact students? And an airport manager wants to say, no, it's not going to impact them. They're wrong. They are flat out wrong. And not only that, they say, well, we're gonna exempt any of the based people at our airport. Well, okay. So let's get down to the basics of flying, right? What are the 2 most critical phases of flight? Takeoff and landing. Why on earth would any policymaker want to institute policy that will deter people from wanting to practice the 2 most critical phases of flight?
Yeah.
You want them to be more than just current. You want them to be as proficient and a safe pilot as possible. And that is to allow them to go out and not just fly at their airport. You need to practice it in as many different environments as possible to be sharp, to understand like how your airplane responds, how you respond in different situations, in different traffic environments, controlled, uncontrolled, you name it. That's what it takes to be a good pilot, is the practice of those critical phases. And
Yeah.
this policy among 4 airports within about 50 miles of Daytona Beach International Airport are all doing this at the same time certainly raises questions.
Yeah, and
rem-
that's a heavy populated area. Like a lot of students will fly there and go there, but a lot of flight training happens there. And honestly, it affects like, the positive impacts that it might have on this small group of people in a monetary sense. Is it really worth the large impact it has on general aviation and students and renters as a whole in a negative sense of like, this is such a like, this might be something that helps you, but think about all the other people that it's affecting, which I think like in a large scale, like general aviation is so much larger than you can even think.
And I mean, let's kind of zero in on this a little bit. We, as a state, are the largest contributor to pilots that are being certified every year. Percentage-wise, we basically supply the largest amount of new pilots per year. And 4 airports within, 50 miles of each other decide that they are going to start charging fees, coincidentally, right after a meeting that happened in January of this year. And those airports, and fact check me on this if you would, please, Stacey, but I believe that was DeLand, Kissimmee, Flagler, and New Smyrna. Ormond Beach. Yeah. Thank you. I see. This is why I've got to be fact checked. Okay. So inside of that, I have a huge problem because there was 9 airports in total, right?
There were 11 airports that were represented at a meeting in DeLand, and they might have not all physically been there, but they were on either like they called in or something, where they met with Vector, and this is straight from a participant of that meeting, right? That they met, they discussed, these airports wanted to understand more about what Vector could do, more about landing fees, what their potential revenues were. This is a big revenue, little shiny thing that the airport managers just got very excited about. And then and you can't blame them. If I were the consumer, I would do the same thing. They went back to Vector and said, well, if we sign, would you give us a group rate? Would you give us a group discount? Right? And Vector replied, if you sign by October 1, we will give you 20% off of our service fees. And so they hit the ground running to try to institute this and save money while bringing money in. I mean, they are enterprise funds, meaning they've got to pay for themselves, but it's not. And this gets into real details of the compliance handbook that we don't need to get into right now. But even though they are enterprise funds and they need to pay for themselves, the majority of the airports in Florida, especially in this side of Florida that we're talking about, they are already operating in the black. And they have, again, the hard line of how much reserves they can have. It's not there, that hard line. But at the same point, if an airport brings in so much to their community outside of their fence line, then is it really unfair to expect that a city might be or a county might be able to help support that airport financially?
Yeah.
If you look at the economic impact statement that the Florida DOT completed on their airports, I think the last one was 2022. I mean, millions of dollars of benefit fall into the community because of these airports. So I believe that there is flexibility for a community to decide this is such a great benefit to not just our community, but regionally, that we're okay if we don't always have the exact amount of revenues. It's okay if we have to help support the local share of an AIP project. Again, there is flexibility, and the key is communicating what has been thought out. There is very little communication. In fact, my members are so up in arms that they didn't know about this. How come they didn't tell us? Well, I mean, I wore an airport manager's hat, and for a while, I've been in airport management for quite some time. You do what you're required to do. You put it in the newspaper, you advertise it on the website, um, you put the check in the required boxes. But those airport managers that go above and beyond to make sure that each one of their tenants not just gets a mailing, but understands the implications of the policy decision that's about to happen, it's very important. These flight schools, these mechanics, some of these mom and pop shops, they are running on a shoestring. And you know what? Generally speaking, they don't have a whole lot of time to sit and read through a policy or sit and read through a 900 plus page agenda packet for their city commission to see if, oh, wait a minute, is there going to be a new fee put on me today? It's just not right.
I think there's two things from the DeLand ones, particularly because, I dialed in on that and I made a lot of notes based off of that. MT Propellers spoke at that meeting, okay? I think that made an impact. But secondly, I think what really made the impact was one of the commissioners realized that it was a sales pitch. Bottom line, what they were given was a sales pitch. There was the opportunity that was explained. There was the need that was explained. And then they offered the discount, which created the urgency, right? And, professional salesmen love to hear those three things because you've basically got a guaranteed sale. So in the other side of that meeting, though, and I think this is really what drove it home, one of the commissioners definitely picked up on this, is that there is a gentleman that controls a very large business-based aviation fund. I don't know if you remember this gentleman, but
I do remember.
When we talk about local impact, he basically said, if you pass this, I am in the process of moving my very wealthy company into this area, and I am about to invest $10 million in the local economy. Okay. And if you pass this, I will absolutely stop that right now. And I will go somewhere else that is interested in continuing aviation and bringing $10 million into the local economy. And I genuinely believe that was a very large part of why that did not get through in DeLand. Now, I would hope that Cirrus or any one of the other operators out of Kissimmee Airport, if they are hopefully listening, which would be a huge that would be a huge accomplishment if I have somebody at Cirrus that is actually listening to us. But I would hope that they would do the same thing. In my, maybe oversimplified way, I truly believe that this is an attack on general aviation. Because of the way that they are doing it. If it was explained more, if it was not perceived the way that it is or explained the way that it has been explained, then that would be a different story. But for one of the commissioners at a local city council to say, we are doing this because we don't want to be the only place that is not charging a landing fee and having to take all of this traffic from Embry-Riddle and other flight schools. Now that's pretty verbatim of what was said in that meeting. I think it creates a huge problem if we don't start fighting this. We've got to do something. And as far as ADSB is concerned, we were having a little chat before we started recording. Obviously, you weren't quite on them. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, right? But the words that came out of somebody that really didn't understand everything that we're talking about right now, it was a very, surface discussion that I'd had with that person. And they said it seems like they're weaponizing ADSB, which was never supposed to happen. So, that's my 2 cents just there.
And with them using ADSB, like, if this is instituted, how are they going to enforce this landing fee? Like, what happens if I don't pay it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I asked that question directly of Vector, and they said, well, it's up to the airport what the airport's policy is. But in essence, if there are no boundaries set by an airport, they will get their fees, even something as small as maybe $6. It might take several years because they prioritize who they go after, right, by the amount of fee that's owed to them. They told me they will get their fee. And from a business perspective, you think that's great. Yeah, if I were a business owner, I'd want to make sure that people were paying what is due me as well. Then he alluded that some airports may choose to no longer service that tail number. Again, okay, now here I am telling you tail number because I don't know how they specifically would tie it to a pilot versus a tail number in the case where if an airport wants to say, we're no longer going to serve who? Are they no longer going to serve the pilot? Or are they no longer going to serve the tail number?
Yeah.
So that is unclear to me, just flat out. I'm not really sure about that detail. But what I have heard is that an airport will choose to no longer provide service. So you fly in there, let's say, and you owe them $10,000 or something, and you need fuel. They could simply say, no, we're not going to sell you fuel. Alternatively, they do this. I know they do this in Mexico, for example. If you don't pay your overflight fees and you land, they'll put a boot on your airplane until you pay. And whether that's gone that far here in the US, I've not actually had anybody confirm that for me. But when Vector shares that airports will go so far as to say we're not going to provide service to you, well, that opens up a whole other layer. Because what then? Are you now making the third-party FBO the policeman of this? Are the FBOs now going to have to check a list before they walk out to any airplane to see if they're on this list? And then the FBO is now going to be put as the bad guy to a pilot who's going to be rip-roaring mad, right? That he is being told he can't get services. So who's the bad guy here, really, though? And I'm being a little facetious about the using the terms bad guys and that, but you get what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's just there's just too many questions. There's just too many administrative burdens that can fall through. So these airports are talking about allowing validation, if you will. Like if you go in to say a restaurant that's a tenant on the field or a service provider, you use them, that service provider would have to provide the date and the tail number to airport management, and airport management then needs to provide that to Vector, and Vector then, before they send out their invoices at the end of the month, need to make sure that those people get pulled out and that they don't get charged. There's a lot of people in that equation.
Yeah.
And every time you introduce a person, you introduce error, more error than not, right? And so imagine at the end of the month, you go to a restaurant who it's, you've been promised by the airport manager, if you come and use one of our tenants, you're not going to get hit with a landing fee. And then lo and behold, they end up with a landing fee. It's number one, then they have to go through the hassle of providing what to show that they were at that restaurant. So everybody keep your receipts. It's just it just snowballs, right?
Yeah.
The room for error is huge here. All for what? Is it worth it? These itinerant operators, they bring value to your community. In the state of Florida, flight training is huge. It's a huge industry. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
Let me ask you this. So, how accurate is the technology that is tracking. So of course, you mentioned it earlier on, which is the FAA swim system, which is the system-wide information management, correct? Right. That's good. I'm actually just reading a few notes that I made for our conversation, so that works.
So good.
So how accurate is the technology that any of the companies that are creating this business using, how accurate is it?
So I will tell you, I asked that question of Vector, and his response is, well, we can't tell you within inches if you've touched down on the runway. There, and how much is inches? Are we talking a foot? We don't, 2 feet? I mean, and the fact that then Florida DOT, I learned recently that Florida DOT, they engaged a study to evaluate undercounting and overcounting. In other words, they're looking at accuracy of various types of technologies, and Vertower happened to be one of them. And the study revealed that there was, in fact, undercounting in some cases, overcounting in others, and the technology had the ability to be interfered with based on what other technology was around the airport. So and I'm sure that technology can be tweaked here and there, but it's enough of a question. It just adds another layer to that onion that is just making everybody cry as you're starting to cut through it, right?
It's funny because when Caitlyn and I were talking about this, her first response was, sounds like I'm going to be doing an awful lot of low approaches. And I'm like, well, those low approaches might get you pinched for a landing fee even now. Because if the technology isn't, I mean, they've got the tracking technology, right? They have to be able to say, okay, this aircraft was in the vicinity. Then they're going to have to do vertical reference and see, okay, did the aircraft land, or did they just come in the pattern, do a low approach, not touch, and then leave? So is this aircraft liable for a landing fee, or is it not? That's a huge question.
It's going to feel like driving, where you're going to, instead of getting like a cam for like a crash, you're going to get a cam to show that your tires never touch the runway.
That's it. Dashboards for aircraft.
Yeah,
that's
it's going to be just
or
GoPros
dash
instead
cams.
of like on the wing where like all the action is happening. It's going to just be underneath pointing to the tires.
So that's going to be the new business model to help.
And that will make some very sharp pilots as they try to get as close as possible to the runway and then continue on. No, I get it. So technically, they cannot bill an aircraft unless it touches down. Because if they're billing an aircraft in the airspace, it's federally preempted. They are not allowed to do that.
But that comes down to what is the accuracy, and that remains to be seen. We will wait and see. Maybe we'll send Caitlyn out to go test the theory.
Test it. Go test it, Caitlyn.
Oh yeah, I'm all for it.
We'll see if she starts getting hit, knowing that she didn't touch the ground. So okay, and then so legally speaking, how can an airport really enact this without losing their federal funding, et cetera, et cetera? And I am not trying to get you to give the roadmap for any airport to do it, but there's obviously certain needs that they would have to show. And the second part of that question, I know there's a two-part right there, but what could the FAA do to basically help with monetizing, or not monetizing, but help with the burden of keeping airports where they wouldn't need to implement fees like this?
Well, I would tell you, I'll answer the second question first because that's easier in my mind. They need to go back and they need to revisit the AIP formula and the amount of money that is going to general aviation airports.
And that's not been done in how many years?
Okay, so that's where you're going to have to fact check me, but it's about 20.
Okay, so far too long.
Far too long. Maybe even if it's 10, that's still, and I know it's longer than 10, but it's still too long.
Right.
Because look about inflation. I mean, just us as a regular John and Jane Doe, right? We're getting hit left and right with inflationary costs. Everything from my car insurance, my house insurance, the cost of milk, the cost of orange juice. I mean, you name it. Just to the daily living is astronomically, gone up, and so so does the construction costs. So are the consulting services that these airports have to utilize, the professional services.
Just since 2020, construction costs have gone up by about 70%. I mean, personally, I know that to be true. I should have built something in 2020 that I am now building now. It's costing me $100,000 more.
You building a pool?
No, I've already got the pool. I need some more room in the house, so I'm adding an addition. But that literally went. I'll share the numbers. That went from $180,000 to $280,000 was the cheapest I could get a quote.
Yeah.
So some of them were $350,000. So
I always say I don't know what I was doing in 3rd grade. I was messing around on the playground. I should have bought a house. I should have done so many things.
yep.
So every state, now let's talk big state picture here, right? The state of Florida is actually a really great partner to its airports. And they have significant funds there because it's such a visitor-centric state, right? They have a lot of funds that they can put back into their airports. And when that happens, that's superb. And that really helps the general aviation airports. But it's still not making it work. Combining federal and state, and then the general aviation airports, they can't compete with discretionary dollars. And I don't want to lose anybody, but there are dollars that you can compete for at the federal level. And typically small general aviation or just general aviation airports in general don't reach the mark enough to be able to be considered for those discretionary dollars. And so it's people are not recognizing general aviation airports are there to help support the bigger airports, to keep the flight training and the T hangars and so forth and so on, so that the bigger airports can run more efficiently. Now, I'm not saying that they can't work and survive at the same airport, because there's lots of airports that do have a very big presence of general aviation, as well as air carrier operators and 135 operators and helicopter. I mean, you name it. It all works together. However, for more efficiency, with the general aviation airports just on the outside ring of the international or the air carrier airports, the overall airspace does work more efficiently. And the airport themselves, as you're moving around the ground, it's more efficient. Also, there's less regulatory perspective when there's no air carriers on a general aviation. You're not required as a general aviation airport to maintain an airfield fire rescue type of situation. So it's less expensive. It helps with the overall efficiency of the system. Yet then here we are finding these general aviation airports are trying to ratchet up the costs on the users of that. And so what, are we just going to continue to keep pushing people out and out and out from where they really want to be? Is just questionable at best.
Right. So what would you at this point say to a tenant that says, well, these landing fees don't affect me? Because obviously, just in case anybody doesn't know, the tenants are one of the exemptions from paying this. Obviously, military, law enforcement, they would be exempt too. But what would you say to a tenant that's based at the airport and says, well, this fee doesn't affect me, it only affects itinerant airport or air traffic?
What I first would say is, well, what if ultimately the FAA or Florida DOT went to the airport manager and said, you know what, you really can't do that? Would you still support this, Mr. Businessman, Mrs. Businessman, woman? Would you still support this? Because right now you don't think it's a big deal. But what happens if they institute this and it turns out that they really can't give you you can't validate for your customers. You can't validate or waive the fee for your customers. Would you still do it? Would you support it? Should the airport still do it? That's the question. Because every lease is different, every airport is different, how it's set up. There is no, it needs to be reviewed very carefully. And that's my advice to business people.
And then kind of my last question, but I'm going to ask it because I've got a fair few friends that actually have aircraft that are registered under the ADSB privacy agreement. So if those guys are, making their touch and goes in their, Cirrus Vision jets or whatever, are they, how's that going to work? Can that still be collected because it's inside the privacy arena, correct?
Very good question. I had that exact question for Vector myself. And actually, before I spoke with them, I did a little bit of research and spoke to the FAA, and they said, no, if there's a valid reason, like a bill collection, Vector is free to call them and find out who that person is so they can bill them. And the FAA gives them the data. And as soon as they have it in their database, they can utilize it over and over. They don't have to keep going back because, airplanes, once they're in the system, right? They're in the system. So that's the unfortunate part, is these pilots were believing a certain level of privacy, but I guess ultimately it's really just privacy from the surveillance of like your flight aware system.
Yeah.
But not from apparently fee collection.
Right.
Fee collection from all the people in general aviation who
Yep.
are struggling, especially with finances and paying for this, and they want to pursue this. And I had a small joke. Do you guys know how you make a fortune in general aviation?
You start out with one.
Yeah, you start out with a large fortune.
That's right. How do you make $1 million? You got to start out with 10 million, right? Yep.
There's a fair few industries that works in as well. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot. Is there anything else that you really wanted to speak about for this?
Yes. I mean, just in summary, right? In summary, I would say airports that are seriously considering this, they need to do their homework. They need to justify this. They need to communicate this. And they also need to educate their commissioners, their city commissioners, county commissioners, whatever type of government organization that has to approve this. That's really what you need to do, and then get that word out there. In fact, I had conversations with with one particular case, one airport manager, where I said, look, ultimately, if you do end up doing this, you need to get this out. You need pilots to know before they get there. Know before you go. Otherwise, my phone is going to ring off the hook when these pilots are caught off guard because there was no way that they could find out before their wheels touched down that they are now getting hit with a landing fee. And okay, well, AOPA is trying the best we can with our database on our website, where you can go and you can put your type of aircraft in there. We are working on how we work in airports landing fees, because right now they're FBO fees. So we are working in order, if we can't stop them because they've gone through all the checklists, it ends up being fair and reasonable. If they ultimately end up being able to use landing fees, then the next best thing is we need to make sure that our users know exactly what airports are charging these fees. The majority of my members will just fly somewhere else. And you know what? The question is whether that's what the airport's intended, right? If that's if that's really what they wanted, we're giving them what they want. Okay. But still it gets down to, no, at least let them know. It's all, let them know, share the information. And then to my members and all the pilots that are in and around these 4 airports. So DeLand is not a clean cut. And we fought it back with great members, people showing up. That was awesome. But it's not over. They could very well come back, and I suspect they will come back with another ordinance. And don't just think it's a done deal there. And if you are around the other airports or any airport in any other state, pay attention. And while we are the world's largest aviation association, we can be looked at just like the lobbyists. And city commissioners, county commissioners, they don't really take what we say very strongly, but they take what their constituents have to say. So it's really a local fight. Every airport's different, so every fight is slightly different. But show up there, but be respectful, be cool, calm, collected, say what you have in your 3-minute or your 5-minute, and then thank them for their time.
Yeah.
And but just get multiple people to show up. And if you need to, outline what you need to say and give everybody a 3-minute piece of that so that the whole story can be laid out.
Yeah.
That's my advice to both airports and aircraft owners and pilots.
Awesome. Well, I personally want to say thank you very much.
Thank
I know
you so
this started
much.
out as a quick phone call because I was trying to get a read from you, and then after you and I spoke, I'm like, oh man, I got to figure out how to be able to get Stacey on the podcast. So thank you very much for coming on this time.
Thank you.
I would hope that maybe we can get you back on to speak about some other things that are going on inside aviation, maybe some of the more positive things that are going on, but also where and how people can really get involved. Obviously, joining AOPA is a very big piece of that. So, Stacey, do you want to quickly give the plug, get people through to the AOPA website, and get them engaged and get them membered?
Yeah, please go to, if you want to help support everything we do. I work states and locals, but there's a side of the house that works federal. We're all in the same department, but we all work different things, and everything is important from the federal down to the local. So if you want to help support AOPA and what we do, please hop on to aopa.org and join. For those of you who might be looking for a little benefit to join, you can feel free to reach out to me. I think I have a discount code for get $10 off. My email, if I'm allowed to give it, Caitlin, and if I'm allowed to give it, it's my first name dot my last name at aopa.org. So it's Stacey, Stacey .Heaton, as in the heat is on, HEATON, at aopa.org, and I'd be happy to share that discount code with you. Looking forward to helping our members and even our non-members. What we do helps everybody. So any support is appreciated.
I love the way that you've come up with your own little thing for the heat is on right there. That's great. And
I usually get a little giggle with that. Yeah.
Yep. All right. When you said it to me the first time, I was like, oh, that's awesome. I got to figure that out. And then these two had never heard that before. No. And I just got a chance to see both of their faces when that happened. So
I love that.
It was pretty awesome.
I absolutely love that. And you've inspired me, and I just thank you for coming on. And you've even inspired me in a possible new business.
Yeah.
Tire tracker.
Ensuring
that your wheels never touch the ground and your card never gets charged.
Yeah, there you go. See, Caitlin's she's
I love the tagline. She's even got the tagline set. That's right.
Well, again, thanks very much, Stacey. And I think we're good. Take care. Stay safe. And until the next time.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you.